I haven't had time to actually think about what it is to be free, what it means to be free, what it is to have this life back.
Today, we delve into a story that challenges our understanding of justice, shakes our belief in the legal system, and reminds us of the incredible power of resilience and hope. Hi everyone, welcome to True Crime Investigation Channel. In this video, we're going to take a look into the story of Ryan Ferguson, a young man whose life was turned upside down by a crime he didn't commit and a conviction that stunned a nation. In the early morning hours of November 1st, 2001, sports editor Kent Heitholt was found beaten and strangled to death outside his office. Two college-aged men were spotted at the scene, and one of Kent's co-workers got a good look at the one, and she was able to provide a police sketch. However, the evidence at the scene was scarce, and no solid leads presented themselves for the next 2 years. That was until a young man came forward claiming he had committed the crime. But it wasn't only him. He linked his childhood friend to the brutal beating as well, and despite his friend's adamant denial of any involvement, the case went to trial. Was this a case of mistaken identity or false memory? Or had those two been there that night and taken Kent's life? Kent Heitholt was born on January 4th, 1953, in Lawrence, Kansas. Kent was the type of person who didn't seem to have a mean bone in his body. Despite his intimidating frame, Kent was soft and bubbly. Those closest to him described him as a friendly bear of a man, a fitting description for Kent, who stood 6'5" and weighed 300 pounds. He graduated from Jan Burroughs High School before studying journalism at the University of Missouri. It was here that Kent met his future wife, Deborah Evangelista. The pair would go on to welcome 2 children after they married, Kaylee and Vince. Kent had a knack for words and began working at the Nashville Banner in 1995. He remained there for 2 years before moving to the Times in Shreveport, Louisiana, where he worked as a sports editor for 9 years. Kent's final career move came in 1996, when he became the sports editor at the Tribune newspaper in Columbia, Missouri. Kent's co-workers knew him as Haiti. He had a reputation for cultivating his junior sports writing staff in a kind, considerate manner. Kent could tell who needed an extra guiding hand, and who was better off being left to trust their own instincts in the office. Naturally, Kent loved sports, which made his job all the more fulfilling. On Halloween evening, October 31st, 2001, Kent and the other newspaper sports staff were working late on a baseball passage that needed to be published with the season fast approaching. Before they knew it, it was midnight, but still more work remained. Shortly after 2 a.m. on November 1st, Kent left the building. It is unclear whether he was heading home for the night or just getting something from his car. He spoke briefly to co-worker Michael Boyd, a part-time sports writer for the newspaper, for about 10 minutes in the parking lot. Michael supposedly leaves, and Kent is now alone in the parking lot. Within a span of a few minutes, a vicious attack was launched on unsuspecting Kent. What happened next has remained a contentious debate for over 2 decades. We do know that a bag of cat food was found outside his vehicle. You see, Kent had a soft spot for the stray cats that lived in his office neighborhood, so he made sure to keep a bag of cat biscuits in his car at all times. Whenever he noticed the stocks were running low, Kent would fill the dishes up to keep the strays well fed. I believe this really shows the type of person Kent was. As it was now the start of November, winter was fast approaching, and Kent made sure the cats were able to start stocking up for the upcoming freeze. Some reports even suggest he had been focused on filling up the cat food dishes when the attack occurred. Not long after Kent had walked out of the building, Shauna Ornt, a janitor for the building, followed suit for a smoke break in the brisk night air. In the haze of the evening light, Shauna can make out 2 figures standing near Kent's car. They seem to almost duck down as she walks out, and she knows this could mean someone is up to no good. Shauna headed back inside to find someone to help her see who was out there. This ended up being janitor Jerry Trump. By the time they exit the building to see what's going on near Kent's car, Jerry and Shauna spot a large body lying sprawled out across the ground. Not yet knowing who this is, Jerry shouts out, "I see you there. Who's out there?" A voice simply responds, "Somebody's hurt, man." As Jerry and Shauna get closer to the figure on the ground, they make a startling discovery. It's Kent Heitholt. He has been violently beaten and is unconscious. Shauna dialed 911 at 2:26 a.m. The authorities arrive, and paramedics are soon on the scene. Tragically, there was nothing they could do for Kent. He had suffered repeated blunt force trauma to the head, as well as asphyxia. His autopsy would later conclude that Kent had been strangled with his own belt with such force that his hyoid bone was fractured. The investigators were now tasked with finding out who had committed such a heinous crime against an innocent man and why. But the quest to answer these questions would not come easy. There were a few fingerprints found on Kent's car and a single bloody hair at the crime scene that had not come from him, along with bloody footprints in Kent's blood-soaked belt buckle found not far from his head. However, none of these got any hits against the police database, and the investigators were back to square one. When Shauna was questioned by the investigators, she told them she had gotten a fairly good look at one of the individuals who were there that night, so much so that she was able to provide a detailed composite sketch, which was then released by the Columbia Police Department. This brought in a handful of leads, but nothing solid enough to help solve the case. That was until 2.5 years later. It was late 2003, and college student Charles Erickson came across an article by the Columbia Tribune that was covering Kent Heitholt's unsolved murder. He notices the night it occurred, on Halloween, and thinks back to the blur that evening was for him. Charles had bumped into a childhood friend, Ryan Ferguson, after a Halloween party Ryan had just driven up to was shut down. Not wanting to call it a night, Ryan had the idea to call his older sister, who was partying at a downtown bar called By George. He invited Charles to join him, and he readily agreed. The two ended up partying a bit too hard that night, but that's not exactly unusual for 17-year-old boys. Charles, in particular, had been the more heavily intoxicated one, and he had no real memory of what happened after he left the party. However, something stuck out to him from the newspaper article. Alongside the print was the composite sketch that Shauna had helped the authorities create. Charles couldn't help but notice it bore a striking resemblance to himself. By George, the bar he knew they had been at that night, was also not far from the crime scene. Charles began to obsess over the fact that he couldn't remember what happened and feared that he may have been involved. After sitting with this for a few weeks, Charles couldn't shake the thought and decided to speak to Ryan in January 2004. He expressed his fears of their involvement, but Ryan was adamant that wasn't the case. In Ryan's mind, nothing more would come of this. But Ryan did little to calm Charles's fears. He started speaking with close friends about a dream that made him think he and Ryan could have been involved that night. One of Charles's friends ended up calling in a tip regarding Charles's claims, and investigators obtained fingerprints from both him and Ryan to compare to those found at the crime scene. They were not a match. You'd think that would have eliminated them from the suspect pool. You'd be wrong. Since Charles now knew the authorities had his fingerprints and knew who he was, he seemed to spiral further. He continued to tell friends similar stories of his concerns, and that led to more tips being phoned in. Since his name had been brought up multiple times, Charles was brought in for questioning on March 10, 2004. After getting a confession from Charles, both he and Ryan were arrested. Charles was offered a plea deal if he testified against Ryan at their 2005 trial. When he was called to the witness stand,
he was down here and he had a belt, and he had his foot on his back, on the victim's back, and he was pulling up on the belt.
Charles told the jury that he remembered Ryan standing over Kent and strangling him. Jerry Trump also testified, and he was able to positively identify both Charles and Ryan from the crime scene. The defense tried to show the jury what the evidence was telling them. Neither the fingerprints, blood, or hair could be matched to either Charles or Ryan, and not even trace amounts of Kent's blood were found in Ryan's car. Considering how brutal the crime scene was, this was highly unlikely. However, despite the defense's best efforts and Ryan maintaining his innocence, he was convicted of second-degree murder and robbery. His sentence was 40 years behind bars. Ryan would be 60 years old before he got out. Charles was given a lesser sentence of 25 years in return for his testimony against Ryan. But did they have the right people? No, not in the slightest. Let's rewind.
No, like I think it was a shirt or something. Or
Well, I know it wasn't a shirt.
it's like maybe a bungee cord or.
Well, we know for a fact that his belt was ripped off of his pants and he was strangled with his belt.
Really?
You didn't put anything in your hand then?
No. I mean, I don't remember that at all.
From the moment Charles stepped into the interrogation room, he was being coached into giving a false confession. The men in the room with him are Columbia Police Detective John Short and Detective Jeff Nichols. From their early questions, it should have been clear to these two that Charles had no idea what happened that night, nor was he there. At that point, the interrogation should have been wrapped up and Charles sent on his way. But that's not what happened. When Detective Short asks Charles what Kent was strangled with, he doesn't know. As you already know, it was his own belt. Charles throws out some suggestions, like a shirt or a rope. Now the detectives know neither of those items were used, so in order to get a sufficient confession, Detective Short starts to spoon-feed Charles information. Still, he cannot remember any details of the crime. As Detective Short continues, Charles replies, "I might not even know what I'm talking about. I don't know if I'm just flipping out. I'm making presumptions based on what I read in the newspaper." The detectives ramp up the pressure on Charles. He still doesn't give them the information they need. He suggests Kent was hit once when he was hit more than 10 times. But despite giving all of the wrong information, the continued pressure by both men eventually leads to Charles breaking down and saying it must have been him. The detectives took that as their confession. The manipulation only continued from there. They drove him to the parking lot where Kent was killed, and Charles had no idea where they were. You may be wondering why Charles testified against Ryan. He did it because the lead prosecutor, Kevin Crane, told him that Ryan was going to testify against him. That was a complete lie. In addition, Kevin had spoken to Jerry Trump while he was in police custody for an unrelated crime about identifying Charles and Ryan as the pair on the scene that night. While Jerry confidently told the jury he could positively identify the two young men on trial as the individuals in the parking lot that night, he failed to mention that on the night of Kent's murder, he told the 911 operator he couldn't provide any description of the men. Just wait, it gets worse. Remember Shauna and her police sketch? She was shown an image of both Charles Erickson and Ryan Ferguson, and neither was the person she saw that night. She told Kevin Crane this, but it was swept under the carpet, only to come to light years later. While it may be hard for some to sympathize with Charles, it is important to keep in mind what headspace he was in during this time. He had been legitimately concerned about being involved in the crime, a concern that should have been squashed during that interrogation. Had Charles been told by the detectives, "Look, son, you may be a bit fuzzy about what happened that night, but you clearly don't know what happened to this man," then their story would have ended there. Instead, he fell victim to two predatory detectives, hungry to solve a case regardless of guilt, and a prosecutor hell-bent on getting a conviction. Charles believed he could be facing the death penalty, and testifying against Ryan was what he needed to do to save his life. He is not the bad guy in this story. That role is solely reserved for those who put him in that situation. Following Ryan's sentencing, he developed somewhat of a following from advocacy groups that could see there were never grounds for a conviction in the first place. A few years went by before Chicago-based attorney Kathleen Zellner caught wind of the case in 2009 and decided to take it on pro bono, meaning at no cost to Ryan. She had a long fight ahead of her. After learning of Ryan's release, Charles requested to speak with Kathleen in 2009. She arranged an interview and spoke with Charles, finding he was still confused about what happened that night. He told Kathleen he had no recollection of the night and stated he had trusted the authorities. When they convinced him he was involved, Charles truly believed them. During this interview, Charles takes back any claim of Ryan killing Kent, but now says Ryan tried to prevent him from killing Kent. It wasn't until 3 years later in 2012 that Charles officially recanted all of his trial testimony, as did Jerry Trump. Michael Boyd, the last confirmed person to see Kent alive, was called as a witness during a hearing called on behalf of Ryan's team. As Kathleen continued to question him, she found he alluded to a timeline that would have placed him with Kent over the time he was murdered. Furthermore, Michael's 5 conflicting stories were highlighted. Shockingly, he had never been called in as a sworn witness in any of the previous hearings. Once she felt she had all the facts in order and the glaring miscarriages of justice, Kathleen filed an appeal with the Missouri Court of Appeals. She highlighted the information withheld from the defense, namely Shauna's statement that neither Charles nor Ryan was the man she saw that night. Perhaps one of the most glaring pieces of evidence that the prosecution withheld from the defense was the established time frame. You can't commit a murder if you're somewhere else, right? During the original trial, Charles said he and Ryan went back to the bar at roughly 2:45 a.m. after the murder. He added that the same bouncer who had let them in earlier in the evening was still there. Then, Charles said they left between 4 and 4:30 a.m. The problem with this statement was that the bar closed at 1:30 a.m. In addition, a witness was able to positively confirm that Ryan and Charles left 10 odd minutes before closing. That left a glaring hole in Charles's coach story, and had the defense had this information, as is their right, they would have been able to discredit Charles's testimony. After a decade in prison, Ryan Ferguson's conviction was vacated in November 2013 due to the actions of the prosecution. The evidence was so overwhelming in favor of Ryan's innocence that the state attorney general publicly announced no further charges would be pursued. Ryan didn't wait long before making sure someone was held responsible for what happened to him. On March 11, 2014, he filed a civil suit against 11 individuals in Boone County, Missouri, as well as the city of Columbia. Needless to say, Ryan had a host of weighted allegations. This included malicious prosecution, conspiracy to deprive constitutional rights, defamation, exculpatory evidence, and reckless or intentional failure to investigate, among other issues. While the case against Kevin Crane was dismissed, Ryan was awarded $11 million in damages in July 2017, equaling $1 million for each year he spent behind bars and an additional $1 million for inquired legal expenses. What about Charles? You wouldn't have blamed Ryan if he held a grudge against Charles for his role in securing his conviction. However, as a true testament to the type of person Ryan is, he vowed to help get Charles out. After filing an unsuccessful appeal in December 2018, Charles was released on parole in January of this year. He had served 18 years behind bars of his 25-year sentence. In the end, it seems the people tasked with investigating this case forgot their job: to solve the murder of Kent Heitholt. Someone out there took a man's life in one of the most violent, callous ways and left him bleeding, face down on the tarmac. Whoever that person is needs to face justice. Many who have looked into the case have questioned Michael Boyd's possible role in Kent's death. We know for a fact he was the last confirmed person to see him alive, and contradicting statements have placed him at the crime scene. When investigators were collecting evidence in the parking lot, they found papers under Kent's car that strongly suggested Michael had been there. These were high school basketball schedules, and that is what Michael covered for the newspaper. Kent did not. He was interviewed twice in the weeks after Kent's murder, but despite conflicting information in each of these interviews, he was not pursued as a suspect. He told one detective he was speaking to a janitor named Micah Henry for 10 or so minutes when he saw Kent leave the building, and another detective he was alone in his car when he saw Kent come out. In the second version, Michael claimed to have pulled it out of his parking spot and driven up to Kent with his window down to talk to him. If that were the case, how would his papers end up under Kent's car? Additionally, why wasn't that his story the first time around? Ryan's civil suit detailed much of Michael's discrepancies in their effort to highlight the lack of investigative work done by officers on the case. Listen to the following excerpt. Boyd has admitted that when he arrived home after the murder, he immediately washed his clothes and put on a long-sleeved sweatshirt. Boyd has stated that he arrived back at the Tribune at approximately 4:15 or 4:30 a.m., and that when he arrived, he saw Heitholt's body face down. This is impossible, as Heitholt's body was turned face up when he was discovered by other Tribune employees at approximately 2:25 a.m. The only other individual who knew how Heitholt's body was originally positioned was the killer. Boyd has also stated that he saw paramedics and a lot of emergency lights at the scene when he arrived. However, the paramedics had left the scene long before 4:15 a.m. In fact, Defendant Nichols was called to the scene at 2:30 a.m., and the paramedics were already gone by the time he arrived. Ryan's civil suit also mentioned a conflict between Michael and Kent shortly before Kent's death, that had not previously been brought up in any police documents. Allegedly, there had been an alteration between the two regarding work of Michael's. Kent was his supervisor at the newspaper, and Michael had made a major mistake on a work assignment. If you feel passionate about Kent receiving justice and would like answers, or at least some clarity, regarding the investigation into Michael Boyd, there will be a Change.org petition linked below. It seems his story got lost in the chaos, and while there is no doubt Ryan and Charles each suffered in different ways, Kent Heitholt lost his life. His family needs answers, and a killer needs to be taken off the streets, where they have been allowed to remain for far too long.